My name is Iris Sapphire, and I am 32 years old, but for a very long time, I was merely a shadow cast by the towering expectations of people who never intended for me to shine. My mother, Eleanor Sapphire, sat at our polished mahogany breakfast table that Tuesday morning in August of 2010, the humid Connecticut air pressing against the windows of our home in Greenwich. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than my first used car would have, and she didn't even look up from the glossy pages of her town and country magazine as she delivered the sentence that was meant to be my life's execution. "College isn't for people like us, Iris," she said, her voice as cool and detached as the silver spoon she used to stir her Earl Grey tea. "You're staying home to pay for your brother's 2010 Lexus IS 250 payments. Yale doesn't need a waitress." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, vibrating through the cold tile floor of the kitchen where I stood holding a tray of poached eggs that I had prepared exactly to her specifications. I remember the exact smell of the room, a cloying mix of expensive French perfume and the sharp, acidic scent of the lemon water she insisted on drinking every morning to preserve her complexion. She had already called the dean of admissions. She had told them there was a family emergency, that I was withdrawing my acceptance, and that the financial aid package I had fought so hard to secure was no longer needed. She did it with a smile, I'm sure, playing the part of the concerned socialite mother while she systematically dismantled the only escape route I had ever known. For 14 years, my family believed they had successfully buried me beneath the weight of a grease-stained apron at the Sapphire Sun Diner, a local establishment my father, Harrison Sapphire, used as a front for his more creative accounting practices. They watched me scrub the industrial-grade linoleum floors and serve coffee to the morning regulars for 12 hours a day, taking every cent of my tips and my meager hourly wage of $2.13, plus the difference to satisfy the debts of my older brother, Julian. Julian was the golden child, the one who drove the pearl-white Lexus with the tan leather interior and the premium Mark Levinson surround sound system, while I walked 3 miles in the rain because the bus fare was considered an unnecessary luxury. They thought I was broken, a compliant servant to their whims, a girl who had forgotten the taste of ambition. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never noticed I wasn't just clearing plates. I was watching the ledger. I was listening to the way my father whispered into his encrypted BlackBerry in the back office, and I was noticing the discrepancies in the invoices from the food distributors that never seemed to match the inventory in the walk-in freezer. They didn't realize that while they were treating me like a ghost, I was becoming a predator. Today, I am no longer that girl in the apron. I am the lead forensic auditor for a $400 million merger between Global Horizon Holdings and the Sapphire Group, and I am currently sitting in a high-back ergonomic chair in a glass-walled boardroom on the 42nd floor of a skyscraper in Manhattan. The air in here is filtered and scentless, a stark contrast to the smell of old frying oil that lived in my pores for a decade. My name is on the legal documents, but they don't know it yet because I operate under my married name Iris Thorne, and I have spent the last 3 years meticulously building a case that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. I hold their entire fraudulent empire in my hands, typed out in 12-point Calibri font on a series of spreadsheets that track every shell company, every offshore account in the Cayman Islands, and every forged signature Julian used to fund his gambling addiction in Atlantic City. The sheer scale of the theft is staggering. We are talking about $24 million in diverted funds, laundered through a network of defunct car washes and real estate holdings that exist only on paper. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand the depth of the betrayal, I have to take you back to the day the last bit of my childhood died. It was my 19th birthday, and instead of a cake or a card, my father handed me a stack of tax forms for the diner. He told me to sign them as the acting manager, a title he gave me only so he could shield himself from the liability of the tax evasion he was committing. I remember the weight of the cheap plastic pen in my hand. It was a blue Bic-round stick, the kind you buy in packs of 50 for $3. I looked at the numbers on the page, my eyes scanning the columns with the speed I had developed while calculating tips in my head. I saw a line item for $40,000 in renovations for a kitchen that hadn't seen a new coat of paint since 1994. I saw the names of employees who didn't exist, people like John Doe and Jane Smith who were apparently drawing a salary of $55,000 a year. My father stood over me, smelling of expensive scotch and the Cohiba cigars he smoked in his private study, his hand heavy on my shoulder. "Just sign it, Iris," he had muttered, his voice thick with a fake paternal warmth that made my skin crawl. "It's for the family. We all have to do our part to make sure Julian has the best start in life." I signed those papers, but as the ink dried on the cheap pulp of the government forms, I made a silent vow. I would learn everything there was to know about the numbers they were using to enslave me. Every night after the diner closed at 11 p.m., after I had mopped the floors and locked the heavy steel back door, I didn't go home to the cramped attic room in our Greenwich mansion. I went to the local community college library, which stayed open until 2 a.m. I used their computers to study for my CPA exams in secret. I bought used textbooks from thrift stores in neighboring towns so my mother wouldn't see them in the trash. I studied the nuances of the Internal Revenue Code, Section 7201, until I could recite the penalties for tax evasion in my sleep. I learned the difference between tax avoidance and tax fraud, and I realized my family wasn't just cutting corners. They were building a house of cards on a foundation of lies. The contrast between my life and Julian's was a jagged glass edge that I walked on every single day. While I was counting pennies to buy a gallon of milk, Julian was crashing his Lexus into a fire hydrant in downtown Hartford after a night of bottle service at a club where the minimum spend was $2,000. My father didn't scold him. He simply called his connections in the police department, paid the $5,000 fine from the diner's slush fund, and bought him a 2012 BMW M5 the following week as a consolation prize for the stress of the accident. I was the one who had to clean the vomit out of the back seat of the damaged Lexus before the insurance adjuster arrived. I remember the feel of the cold leather against my knuckles and the way the smell of expensive leather cleaner couldn't quite mask the stench of his entitlement. It was in those moments, scrub brush in hand, that my empathy for them finally withered and died. I wasn't their daughter or their sister. I was an asset to be liquidated, a tool to be used until the gears stripped and the motor burned out. The injustice of it was a constant low-grade fever. My mother would host charity galas for underprivileged youth in the ballroom of our home, standing under a 4-tier Swarovski crystal chandelier, wearing a Harry Winston diamond necklace worth more than my 4-year tuition would have been. She would speak into the microphone about the importance of education and opportunity, while her own daughter was in the kitchen, hidden behind the swinging double doors, plating hors d'oeuvres for 300 guests. I watched through the small circular window in the kitchen door as she laughed with the wives of senators and CEOs, her skin glowing under the warm amber light of the room. She was a master of appearances, a woman who had spent 30 years perfecting the art of the lie. But she forgot that the people in the shadows see everything. She forgot that the person who washes the dishes is the one who knows exactly what was served at the table. Now, as the clock on the wall of the boardroom ticks toward 10 a.m., the time scheduled for the final signing of the merger, I feel a sense of calm that is almost terrifying. My father is sitting across from me, his face lined with the stress of the failing Sapphire Group. He looks older now, his hair a thinning silver, his hands slightly trembling as he adjusts his gold Rolex Submariner. He doesn't recognize me. To him, I am just a high-level consultant from a prestigious Manhattan firm, a woman in a tailored charcoal gray power suit from Theory and a pair of black Louboutin pumps. I have changed my hair, my voice, and my very soul. I am the nightmare they created, the silent witness who finally found her voice. When I open my leather-bound portfolio, I won't be pulling out a merger agreement. I will be pulling out the evidence of 14 years of systemic theft, starting with that first forged document from my 19th birthday. The moral of this story is something my father never understood. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who don't ask you to set yourself on fire just to keep them warm. Dignity isn't something that can be bought with a luxury car or a Greenwich zip code. It is something earned in the quiet hours of the night when you choose to be better than the people who tried to break you. As the doors to the boardroom click shut, I realize that the glass isn't there to keep people out. It's there so everyone can watch when the walls finally come crashing down. I look my father in the eye, and for the first time in 14 years, I don't feel fear. I feel the cold, hard weight of justice, and it is the most beautiful thing I have ever held. The silence in the room is absolute, broken only by the hum of the HVAC system and the distant sound of a siren on the street below. It is time to begin. Growing up in our $350,000 suburban home in Oak Haven, Illinois, the math of our daily existence never truly added up. And as a girl who saw the world in columns and rows, the discrepancies haunted me like a recurring fever dream. My father, Richard Sapphire, portrayed himself to the neighbors as a high-level strategic consultant, a title that sounded impressive over-the-fence conversations about lawn aeration, but in reality, he spent more time consulting the amber depths of a glass than he did any actual clients. He had a specific ritual every Friday evening where he would visit the local boutique liquor store on Elm Street and walk out with a bottle of Whistle Pig 15-year-old straight rye whiskey, a habit that drained exactly $1,200 a month from our household accounts. Meanwhile, my older brother Declan was the undisputed golden child of the Sapphire residence, a boy who seemed to possess a supernatural ability to fail upward while leaving a trail of twisted metal and rising insurance premiums in his wake. By the time Declan was 20, he had totaled 3 separate vehicles, including a 2018 midnight blue Volkswagen GTI that he wrapped around a telephone pole just 3 weeks after my father handed him the keys. I wasn't the daughter in that house. I was the financial battery, a silent, pulsing source of energy that kept the lights on while the rest of the family basked in a glow they hadn't earned. At 17, while my peers were attending varsity football games at Oak Haven High or planning their senior prom outfits, I was clocking 38 hours a week at Miller's Greasy Spoon, a local diner where the air always tasted of burnt coffee and cheap vegetable oil. I earned $8.25 an hour plus tips, which on a good Saturday double shift could sometimes push my take-home pay toward $300 for the week. However, that money never stayed in my pocket long enough to grow warm. Every Sunday evening, my mother, Eleanor, would sit at the kitchen island with a floral-patterned ledger and demand my envelope of cash, insisting it went into a family pot meant for our collective future. That collective future was a lie that miraculously funded Declan's $450 a month car modifications, specifically a custom Borla exhaust system and neon underglow lights for his latest 2021 Honda Civic Type R, along with my mother's weekly $65 appointments at the Serenity Salon for her signature platinum blonde highlights. I remember the sharp, stinging sensation of the winter wind through the holes in the soles of my $12 sneakers from a clearance bin at a discount warehouse, a stark contrast to the pristine $180 Air Jordan 1 Retros that Declan wore to go sit on a park bench and do absolutely nothing. I was a ghost in my own house, a revenue stream with a heartbeat, and I learned very early on that in the Sapphire family, love was a currency that was only spent on those who provided the least value. The interior of our home was a masterpiece of suburban deception, with its beige siding and perfectly manicured Kentucky bluegrass. But inside the walls, the tension was a physical weight that I carried in the small of my back. My father's office was a shrine to his own ego, filled with leather-bound books he never read and a heavy oak desk where he would sit for hours, ostensibly working on mergers and acquisitions, but actually just staring at the bottom of a crystal tumbler while the ice melted into a watery grave. I was the one who had to sneak into that office every Tuesday to collect the empty bottles and hide them at the bottom of the recycling bin so the neighbors wouldn't see the sheer volume of his consumption. I was the one who learned how to forge his signature on the utility bills because he was often too intoxicated to hold a pen. ensuring that the Commonwealth Edison electric bill and the Nicor gas statement were paid just days before the disconnection notices arrived. My mother was an accomplice in this domestic theater, spending her afternoons organizing neighborhood bake sales while I was in the back of Miller's greasy spoon, scrubbing the industrial-grade grease traps with a wire brush until my knuckles bled. She would look at me when I came home, smelling of onions and floor cleaner, and her only comment would be to ask if I had made enough in tips to cover the extra $100 Declan needed for a new carbon fiber spoiler. Now, as I sit in this high-tech audit suite in the heart of the financial district, the memories of those grease-stained floors feel like a lifetime ago, yet they are the very foundation upon which I built my current armor. My name is Iris Sapphire, and I am 32 years old, a woman who has spent the last decade mastering the art of the forensic trail, a skill I first honed while trying to figure out how my father was paying for a country club membership on an income that didn't exist. I am currently looking at a digital footprint of my father's secret accounts, and the irony is not lost on me that the very man who once called me a failure for forgetting to refill his whiskey decanter is now the subject of my most comprehensive investigation. I have traced the $400 million merger between Global Horizon Holdings and my father's current shell company, Sapphire Strategic Partners, and what I found is a cavernous void of embezzled funds and fraudulent tax shelters. They thought I was just a waitress, a girl who would never understand the complexities of offshore banking or the subtle nuances of money laundering, but they forgot that a girl who has to budget for her own survival on $8 an hour becomes the most dangerous person in the room when she finally gains access to the vault. The feeling of invisibility I experienced as a teenager was a double-edged sword. While it wounded my spirit, it also provided me with a cloak of anonymity that allowed me to observe the rot from within. I saw the way my mother would hide the credit card statements from the Nordstrom rack sprees under the lining of the linen closet, and I watched my brother sell the high-end stereo equipment my father bought him just to fuel a gambling habit that he picked up at the local underground poker games. They were all so busy consuming each other and the resources I provided that they never realized I was keeping my own ledger, a small black notebook hidden behind the loose baseboard in my bedroom where I recorded every dollar they stole from my future. I remember the specific smell of that notebook, a mix of old paper and the lavender sachet I used to mask the scent of the diner, and it became my Bible, my roadmap to a life they couldn't touch. Every time I had to choose between a hot meal and a bus pass because my mother had emptied my dresser drawer of my secret savings, I added a new line to my mental balance sheet, calculating the interest on the debt they owed me. The contrast between the life I lived then and the life I have curated now is a testament to the power of a quiet, burning rage. My current apartment in the Gold Coast of Chicago is a minimalist sanctuary of glass and steel, where the only sound is the hum of my high-end server rack and the distant chime of the elevator. I don't wear $12 sneakers anymore. I wear custom-made Italian leather loafers that click with a satisfying, authoritative snap on the marble floors of the corporate offices I now frequent. But beneath the expensive fabric and the professional veneer, I am still that girl from Oakhaven who knows exactly what it costs to keep a lie alive. My father's current business model is just a larger version of the family pot my mother used to manage, a grand-scale deception designed to siphon value from unsuspecting investors to fund a lifestyle of unearned luxury. He thinks he is the smartest man in the room, leaning back in his ergonomic chair and spinning tales of projected growth and market dominance, while I sit across from him, my laptop open to a spreadsheet that proves he hasn't had a legitimate client in 6 years. But I am getting ahead of myself, and the story of how the financial battery finally overloaded the circuit is one that requires a careful, methodical unfolding. I remember a specific night in October of my senior year, when the temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling 38 degrees, and the heater in our Oakhaven home had failed because my father had spent the repair money on a vintage humidor. I was huddled under 3 blankets, my breath visible in the dim light of my desk lamp as I studied for an advanced placement calculus exam. My brother Declan came into my room without knocking, his breath smelling of cheap beer and desperation, demanding $20 so he could go get a burger with his friends. When I told him I didn't have it, that my mother had already taken my entire paycheck that morning, he laughed and told me I was useless, that a girl like me was lucky to even have a roof over her head. He didn't see the way my hands tightened around my pencil until the wood snapped in half. He didn't see the moment the last shred of my loyalty to the sapphire name dissolved into ash. That night was the beginning of my true education, the moment I realized that if I was going to be a battery, I would be the kind that could also deliver a lethal shock. I began to intentionally misreport my tips to my mother, hiding small increments of $5 and $10 bills in the ductwork of the attic. I volunteered for the late-night closing shifts at Miller's, not because I wanted the extra work, but because the owner, an old man named Arthur who saw more than he let on, allowed me to use the office computer to research scholarships and financial aid programs. I learned that Yale offered a need-based program that could cover my entire tuition if I could just prove my independence, a task that seemed impossible given my family's control over my life, but I was nothing if not patient. I began to collect the evidence of my father's consulting fees, actually just kickbacks from local contractors, and I filed them away in my hidden notebook, knowing that one day these numbers would be the bars of the cage I would build for them. The dynamic of the golden child and the invisible daughter is a classic tragedy, but in our house it was played out with a hyper-realistic cruelty that left no room for error. My parents truly believed that I would always be there to catch Declan when he fell, that I would be the one to quietly settle his debts and smooth over his mistakes while they continued their masquerade of suburban perfection. They never considered that the person you treat as a ghost might eventually decide to haunt you. They never imagined that the girl scrubbing the grease from the diner tables would one day be the lead forensic auditor deciding the fate of their $400 million legacy. As I prepare for the final meeting of the merger, I can almost taste the irony in the air, a flavor far more satisfying than the expensive whiskey my father still insists on drinking. The math is finally beginning to add up, and for the first time in my 32 years, the balance is heavily in my favor. Family isn't a blood bond that gives people the right to bleed you dry. It's a social contract that they broke a long time ago, and today I am here to collect on the arrears. The betrayal did not arrive with a scream or a cinematic crash, but rather with the cold, mechanical precision of a digital timestamp on a Tuesday evening at exactly 6:14 p.m. I was sitting in the cramped corner of the Oak Haven Public Library, hunched over a flickering Dell monitor that smelled of ozone and dust, when I finally bypassed the security filters on my personal email account that my mother had secretly mirrored onto her own device. There it was, sitting in the sent folder like a venomous snake, a formal letter addressed to the Yale University Office of Undergraduate Admissions, sent from my address but written in the chillingly sophisticated prose my mother used for her country club newsletters. The letter stated, with a heartbreaking level of feigned regret, that I, Iris Sapphire, was formally withdrawing my acceptance and declining the full-ride Benjamin Silliman Scholarship because of pressing personal family obligations that required my full-time presence at home. They hadn't just discouraged me or whispered doubts into my ear during the long shifts at the diner. They had reached into the digital ether and performed a surgical strike on my future, committing a calculated act of identity theft to ensure their financial battery never left the charging station. The room seemed to tilt on its axis as I realized that the university I had dreamed of since I was 6 years old now viewed me as a girl who had walked away from a golden ticket, all because my parents couldn't bear the thought of losing the $8.25 an hour I brought into their parasitic ecosystem. When I arrived back at the house on Oak Haven Drive, the air was thick with the scent of my father's expensive Whistle Pig whiskey and the sound of a baseball game blaring from the 75-inch television he had bought using the family pot funds. I confronted them in the hallway, my voice trembling not with fear but with a cold, crystalline rage that I had been refining for 17 years. My father, Richard, didn't offer an apology or even a denial. Instead, he stepped forward to physically block the passage to my bedroom, his massive frame casting a shadow over me that felt like a prison wall. He looked down at me with eyes that were bloodshot and devoid of anything resembling paternal love, demanding that I hand over my final $312 paycheck from Miller's Greasy Spoon as back rent for the privilege of living in the house they had used me to subsidize. He told me that until I paid my debt to the family, I didn't own the air I breathed, let alone a future in New Haven, and he laughed when I mentioned the word identity theft, reminding me that in this town, he was Richard Sapphire, and I was just a waitress with a vivid imagination. It was in that moment, standing between the beige walls of a home that had become a holding cell, that I realized I was no longer fighting for a seat at a university. I was fighting for my very survival against two people who viewed my existence as a line item on their personal balance sheet. The cruelty escalated with a calculated ferocity the following morning, the day I had scheduled my emancipation hearing at the Cook County Courthouse. I had spent months quietly preparing my case, documenting the financial abuse and the physical intimidation, and I had invested every spare cent I managed to hide into a rusted 2002 silver Honda Civic that I had purchased for $1,500 from a mechanic 3 towns over. It was a vibrating, rattling piece of junk with a persistent oil leak and a passenger door that only opened from the outside. But to me, it was a chariot of fire that would carry me away from Oak Haven forever. However, as I pulled out of the driveway at 8:30 a.m., dressed in the only professional blouse I owned, I didn't see my father calling the Oak Haven Police Department from the front porch. He didn't just want to stop me. He wanted to destroy my record so that no university or employer would ever look at me again. He reported the car I had paid for with my own sweat and blood, the car he had never contributed a single penny toward, as stolen, claiming I had taken the keys from his dresser while he was sleeping. At 8:45 a.m., the flashing blue and red lights of a Ford Explorer Interceptor filled my rearview mirror on Route 41, just 2 miles from the courthouse. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, the sound of the passing morning traffic a blurred roar in my ears, and I watched through the grime-streaked windshield as the officer approached with his hand resting ominously on his holster. I tried to explain. I tried to show him the bill of sale that I kept in the glove box, but my father had been thorough. He had titled the car in his name under the guise of helping me with the insurance, another lie I had been too desperate to see through. I was ordered out of the vehicle, the humid morning air clinging to my skin as the cold steel of the handcuffs ratcheted shut around my wrists with a series of sharp, final clicks. As I stood there, leaning against the hot metal of the Honda, while the officer ran my information, I looked back toward the direction of our neighborhood and saw my father's black 2023 Chevrolet Tahoe idling at the edge of the intersection. He was leaning against the driver's side door, a smirk of pure, unadulterated triumph etched onto his face as he watched his daughter being treated like a common criminal on the side of the highway. That was the exact second the girl named Iris Sapphire, the one who still hoped for a scrap of validation or a moment of parental warmth, died on the burning asphalt of Route 41. In her place, something far more dangerous was born, the Auditor. As I sat in the back of that police cruiser, the plastic seat hard against my spine and the smell of stale coffee and cigarettes filling the cabin, I stopped crying and started calculating. I stopped feeling the sting of the betrayal and started cataloging the vulnerabilities in my father's armor. I realized that if he wanted to use the law as a weapon, I would simply have to master the law better than he ever could. I spent the 4 hours I was held in the precinct cell not in a state of panic, but in a state of intense meditative focus, mentally reconstructing every financial document I had ever seen him sign and every whispered conversation I had overheard about his offshore consulting fees. I realized that my father's greatest weakness was his arrogance. He believed I was too small to see the patterns, too insignificant to understand the architecture of his fraud. He thought he had ended my journey before it began, but all he had really done was provide me with a motive that would sustain me through the next 14 years of grueling study and clinical emotional detachment. The auditor doesn't feel. The auditor observes, verifies, and reconciles. I watched as the charges were eventually dropped 3 days later because even the local police could see the domestic dysfunction for what it was. But the damage to my Yale admission was already permanent. I didn't go back to the house on Oak Haven Drive to collect my things. I walked straight from the police station to the bus terminal with nothing but the clothes on my back and the $312 check that I had hidden in my shoe. I spent the next decade living in a series of studio apartments that were barely larger than the diner's walk-in freezer, working 3 jobs while I put myself through a state school accounting program. I became a ghost in the financial world, a woman who specialized in the shadows where people like Richard Sapphire hid their sins. I learned how to track the movement of money through the most complex labyrinth of shell companies and deferred tax assets. And I did it all with the memory of that smirk on Route 41 acting as my North Star. My transformation into Iris Thorne was a masterpiece of personal rebranding, a necessity to ensure that when I finally stepped back into my father's orbit, he wouldn't see the daughter he had humiliated, but a high-level professional he would be forced to respect. I moved to New York City and climbed the ladder at one of the top forensic accounting firms in the country, eventually becoming the lead auditor for high-stakes mergers. My specialty became the deep dive, the process of digging through years of historical data to find the one inconsistency that could topple a billion-dollar empire. I became known for my stamina and my ability to remain completely impassive even when faced with the most egregious displays of corporate greed. My colleagues thought I was just dedicated to the craft. They didn't know that every time I uncovered a hidden account or a forged signature, I was practicing for the day I would finally balance the books of the Sapphire family. The contrast between the personal family obligations my mother wrote about and the reality of my life was a void I filled with technical expertise. While Julian was coasting through a low-tier business school on a path paved with my father's bribes, I was sitting in the back of graduate-level lectures on international tax law, my eyes burning from the blue light of a laptop screen as I cross-referenced the Sapphire Group's public filings with the private data I had been collecting for years. I knew about the $400 million merger with Global Horizon Holdings months before it was officially announced, and I manipulated my firm's internal staffing metrics to ensure that I was the only logical choice to lead the due diligence team. I wanted to be the one to sign off on the audit. I wanted to be the one who looked at the 400-page report and decided whether the Sapphire family would ascend to a new level of wealth or be cast into the abyss of federal litigation. Now, as the final meeting for the merger approaches, the hyper-realism of my surroundings feels like a carefully constructed stage. The boardroom table is a 20-foot slab of polished black granite, reflecting the recessed LED lighting in the ceiling like a dark, still lake. My father sits at the far end, wearing a bespoke suit that likely cost more than my first 3 years of rent combined, unaware that the woman sitting across from him, the one he calls Ms. Thorne with a sycophantic nod, is the same girl he left handcuffed on the side of a highway. He is currently explaining a suspicious $12 million consultancy expense as a standard operational cost, his voice carrying that same arrogant cadence I remember from the hallway in Oak Haven. I listen to him lie with a clinical fascination, watching the way his pulse thrums in his neck, and I feel a profound sense of closure. The auditor doesn't seek revenge. The auditor seeks the truth. And the truth is that Richard Sapphire has been insolvent for a decade, propped up only by the very theft he accused me of committing. The moral of this chapter of my life is that you cannot bury someone who is made of the very soil you are trying to hide them in. My parents tried to use my identity as a shield for their failures, but in doing so, they gave me the keys to their destruction. They taught me that the most powerful weapon in the world isn't a luxury car or a prestigious name. It is the ability to see the world as it actually is, stripped of the veneer of social status and familial obligation. As I prepare to present my findings, I realize that the girl who wanted to go to Yale would have been a successful academic, but the auditor who survived the betrayal is a force of nature. The glass boardroom is silent, the tension thick enough to be felt in the teeth, and I am ready to turn the page. The debt is finally due, and I am the only one authorized to collect. I spent the next decade of my life existing in the long, cold shadows of a world that had forgotten I was ever a part of it, transforming my very essence from a girl seeking approval into a precision instrument designed for a single devastating purpose. To the elite students at Yale University, I was a nameless silhouette in a navy blue jumpsuit, the girl who scrubbed the industrial-grade porcelain toilets in the Sterling Memorial Library at 3 a.m. to cover the grueling gaps in my financial aid grants. While my classmates discussed neoclassical architecture and the future of global equity over $20 artisanal avocado toasts, I was calculating the exact number of hours I needed to work to afford a single gallon of milk and a bus pass that would get me to my second job at a 24-hour laundromat in New Haven. My life was a relentless cycle of 80-hour work weeks and academic intensity that would have broken a person with something left to lose, but I had already been hollowed out on the side of Route 41, leaving behind a vacuum that I filled with the cold, hard logic of GAAP principles and tax litigation. I slept exactly 4 hours a night on a $50 thrift store mattress that smelled faintly of damp wool and old cedar, its springs groaning under my weight in a cramped 400-square-foot studio apartment where the radiator clanked like a dying machine. It was during those silent, frozen nights in Connecticut that I reached a fundamental realization that would become my North Star. Emotions are volatile, treacherous, and easily manipulated by the people who claim to love you. But ledgers are absolute, immutable, and eventually, they always tell the truth. I stopped being a daughter that winter, shedding the skin of iris sapphire and replacing it with the reinforced steel of the Auditor, a machine that functioned on data points rather than heartbeats. I didn't reach out to my mother on her birthday, nor did I send a card when I heard through a distant cousin that Julian had crashed yet another car, this time a 2016 BMW M3 that my father had somehow managed to finance despite the diner's dwindling legitimate revenue. Instead, I tracked them from a distance with the patient, unblinking focus of an apex predator watching its prey from the edge of a watering hole. I utilized the university's high-speed fiber optic network to access public records, SEC filings, and property tax databases, building a digital dossier on my family that grew thicker with every passing semester. I watched through a screen as my father, Richard, miraculously pivoted from a failing diner owner to the CEO of a new entity called Sapphire Logistics, a shell company headquartered in a nondescript office park in Oak Haven that boasted profit margins that were mathematically impossible for a man with no logistical experience and a documented history of alcohol-fueled mismanagement. I saw the way the money flowed through the company like a poisoned river, diverted from legitimate-looking invoices into a series of LLCs with names like RS, Strategic Holdings, and Blue Water Acquisitions, all of which led back to a single private mailbox in Grand Cayman. I waited with a predatory stillness, ignoring the occasional pangs of loneliness that tried to surface when I saw families together on the New Haven Green, because I knew that a shouting match at a Thanksgiving table would be a fleeting, unsatisfying catharsis. I didn't want a tearful confrontation or a dramatic reveal over a turkey dinner. I wanted a forensic trail so dense and so undeniable that it would lead directly to the heavy mahogany doors of a federal courtroom. I spent my weekends in the basement of the law school library, teaching myself how to trace layering in money laundering schemes, studying the way criminals use wire transfers under $10,000 to avoid the scrutiny of the Bank Secrecy Act. I saw the Sapphire Logistics fleet expand to 10 black 2020 Freightliner Cascadia semi-trucks, and I knew, just by looking at the fuel tax credits they were claiming, that those trucks were hauling air more often than they were hauling cargo. My father was getting greedy, emboldened by a decade of thinking his invisible daughter was rotting in a gutter somewhere, and his arrogance was leaving a scent of digital blood that I followed across every spreadsheet and every hidden ledger I could find. The hyper-realism of my poverty during those years was the whetstone that sharpened my resolve, making the contrast between my life and theirs a constant, thrumming motivator. While my mother was posting photos on social media of her new $15,000 Hermes Birkin bag and their vacation to the Four Seasons in Bora Bora, I was sewing the hem of my only professional skirt with a stolen needle and thread so I wouldn't look out of place in my advanced auditing seminar. I lived on 50-cent packets of ramen and the occasional leftover bagel from the library cafe, my body leaning out until I looked as sharp and dangerous as the figures I was auditing. I remember the smell of the bleach I used to clean the university floors, a sharp, stinging chemical scent that cleared my head and reminded me that I was scrubbing away the last traces of the girl who had been handcuffed Iris. Every time my back ached from the physical labor, I would visualize the moment I would finally sit across from my father in a professional capacity, not as a victim, but as the person holding the keys to his prison cell. I became a master of the shadow economy, learning how to read between the lines of a balance sheet to find the plug numbers, the fake entries used to make a fraudulent business look like it was thriving. I tracked the acquisition of their new residence, a $2.8 million estate in the gated community of Highland Woods, noting that the down payment had been wired from a consulting fee paid by a construction firm that was currently under investigation for city contract rigging. I watched Julian's lifestyle through the lens of his public social media profiles, documenting the $400 an hour private golf lessons and the bottles of Ace of Spades champagne he sprayed over crowds at clubs in Miami. It was all being funded by the Sapphire Logistics Shell, a house of cards built on the very foundation of my stolen education and the identity theft they thought I had forgotten. I wasn't angry anymore. I was something much colder. I was an accountant of souls, and I was making sure that when the time came for the final reconciliation, every single cent of the interest they owed me was calculated to the 4th decimal point. I didn't need their love, and I certainly didn't need their apologies. I needed their signatures on a confession, and I was willing to spend every waking hour of my life ensuring that the trap was inescapable. The process of becoming a machine meant eliminating any variable that didn't contribute to the end goal, which included any semblance of a social life or personal joy. I became the top of my class, a ghost who sat in the front row and absorbed information like a sponge, earning the nickname the Ice Queen among my peers who didn't understand that my coldness was actually a form of deep-seated preservation. My professors saw a brilliant, if somewhat robotic, mind, but they didn't see the black notebook I still kept, the one that had grown into an encrypted hard drive filled with thousands of pages of my father's financial sins. I studied for my CPA exam with a ferocity that bordered on the pathological, passing all 4 parts on the first try with scores in the 99th percentile, because I knew that my credentials had to be beyond reproach if I was going to take down a man of my father's standing. I was no longer the girl in the grease-stained apron. I was a 26-year-old forensic specialist with a degree from one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, and I was just getting started. As I moved from Yale into a junior position at a top-tier firm in New York City, I purposely chose the most grueling, high-pressure department, corporate restructuring and forensic investigations. I wanted to see the worst of the worst, to understand the psychology of the white-collar criminal so I could anticipate my father's next move. I spent 3 years working as an anonymous cog in the machine, building my reputation as the person you call when you suspect your partner is stealing from the till. I became an expert in the short-form and long-form audit reports, knowing exactly how to present complex fraud in a way that a jury of 12 ordinary people could understand. I was waiting for the Sapphire Group to grow large enough to attract a merger, knowing that a merger of that size would require an independent third-party audit from a firm exactly like mine. I positioned myself, year after year, project after project, until I was the inevitable choice for the Global Horizon Holdings merger, the $400 million deal that my father believed would be his ultimate retirement windfall. The moral of this decade in the shadows is that silence isn't a sign of weakness. It is a strategic advantage. My family thought my silence meant I had vanished into the world of the working poor, a casualty of their necessary choices. But my silence was actually the sound of a fuse burning toward a massive pile of tinder. I learned that the most effective way to destroy a man like Richard Sapphire is to let him believe he has won, to let him build his empire so high that the fall becomes lethal. I am 32 years old now, and the 4 hours of sleep on a thrift store mattress have been replaced by a quiet, focused energy that fuels my work in the Manhattan boardroom. I look at the ledgers of Sapphire Logistics, and I don't see business transactions. I see the stolen years of my youth, the holes in my $12 sneakers, and the cold metal of handcuffs on a Tuesday morning. The auditor has finished the preliminary report, and the discrepancies are no longer just numbers on a page. They are the nails in the coffin of a family that thought they could bury the truth in the shadows. The light is coming, and it is going to be blinding. By the time I reached my 31st birthday, the transition from the broken girl on the side of Route 41 to a senior partner at Vanguard Forensic Group was complete, a transformation fueled by a cold, clinical obsession that cost me exactly $25,000 in private investigators and high-end data mining services. I lived a life of extreme austerity in a minimalist apartment in Battery Park, funneling every spare cent of my 6-figure salary into a network of former intelligence officers and dark web data analysts who could peel back the layers of the Sapphire family's lies like an onion. My arsenal was not a weapon of steel or lead, but a black, military-grade encrypted Kingston Iron Key flash drive that I carried with me everywhere, a digital weight that contained 10 years of my father Richard's fraudulent tax returns and the true ledger of Sapphire Logistics. Through the data mining reports, I discovered a betrayal that made the original identity theft at Yale look like child's play. My parents hadn't just stolen my past, they were actively cannibalizing my future by using my social security number to open 14 separate credit lines totaling $114,000. They used my credit score, which I had painstakingly rebuilt from the ashes of their neglect, to fund the initial overhead for Sapphire Logistics, purchasing a fleet of 2021 Peterbilt 579 sleeper cabs while I was still eating generic brand cereal in a room that smelled of industrial floor wax. They truly believed I was still drifting through life, perhaps flipping greasy burgers in a different state under a different name, a discarded remnant of their history that would never have the resources to look back. They had no way of knowing that the woman who sat in the sterile, glass-walled offices of Vanguard Forensic Group was the very person who had personally flagged their company for a deep-dive federal audit during the preliminary stages of their $400 million merger with Global Titan Corp. I spent 14 months meticulously building a cage made of 10K filings, offshore bank statements, and suspicious activity reports, weaving a web of evidence that was so structurally sound it could withstand the most expensive defense attorney's money could buy. I spent my nights submerged in the blue light of triple monitors, cross-referencing the manifest logs of Sapphire Logistics with the satellite tracking data I had surreptitiously acquired, proving that 40% of their shipped goods were non-existent phantoms designed to wash illicit consulting fees from local political figures. Every time I uncovered a new wire transfer from a shell company in the British Virgin Islands to my mother Eleanor's private account at a boutique bank in Zurich, I felt a surge of something that wasn't quite joy, but a profound rhythmic satisfaction, like a clock finally ticking toward midnight. I documented the $114,000 in fraudulent credit, tracing every cent as it was moved from my stolen identity into the down payment for my brother Declan's 2024 Porsche 911 GT3 RS, a car he drove with the reckless abandon of a man who thought the bill would never come due. The hyper-realism of my father's greed was breathtaking. He had even listed me as a silent consultant on several state tax forms to claim a small business tax credit for hiring family members, all while he hadn't spoken a single word to me in over a decade. I was a ghost who was technically earning a 6-figure salary on paper in Oak Haven, Illinois, while in reality, I was a forensic predator in New York City, preparing to devour the very empire that was being built on my bones. The technical specifications of their downfall were my nightly prayers, and I memorized the routing numbers and swift codes of their laundered assets with the same intensity I once used to memorize the diner's breakfast menu. I watched through my data mining portals as the merger with Global Titan Corp moved into the final stages of due diligence, knowing that the independent auditor Global Titan had hired was actually a firm I had a reciprocal intelligence sharing agreement with. I didn't just flag them for a routine check. I provided the auditors with a roadmap of anomalies, pointing them toward the exact subledgers where the Sapphire Logistics shell game was hidden beneath layers of complex depreciation schedules for equipment that didn't exist. I saw my mother's Instagram posts featuring her new $40,000 Patek Philippe watch, knowing that the funds used to purchase it had been diverted from a fake payroll account originally opened in my name at a branch of Wells Fargo in Hartford. The irony was a thick, metallic taste in my mouth. They were celebrating their impending wealth with the very tools I was using to ensure their permanent ruin. I spent hours in the Vanguard office long after the cleaning crews had left, the hum of the HVAC system the only witness to my quiet triumph as I added the final piece of the puzzle, a forged signature on a loan application for a $500,000 business line of credit, where my father had clumsily tried to mimic my handwriting from a high school report card he'd kept in a drawer. My life during those 14 months was a masterclass in disciplined deception, as I maintained the persona of a high-flying senior partner while living like a monk in a monastery of data. I didn't buy a new car, I didn't take vacations to the Maldives, and I didn't even tell my closest colleagues about the personal nature of the Sapphire Global Titan merger. I wanted the reveal to be absolute, a total eclipse of their world that would happen in the middle of a sunny Tuesday morning in a boardroom that cost $2,000 an hour to rent. I meticulously tracked the 10K filings of Global Titan, noticing how their stock price was artificially bolstered by the projected savings of the merger, a financial bubble that my evidence was about to pop with the needle-sharp precision of a forensic scalpel. I was the one who drafted the anonymous whistleblower report that triggered the internal investigation at the Department of Justice, making sure the paper trail was clean, but the impact was devastating. I sat in my office in the early hours of the morning, looking out over the flickering lights of Manhattan, and I realized that the family pot my mother had talked about so long ago was finally full. Not with money for Declan's cars or her highlights, but with the evidence required to initiate a RICO investigation. The contrast between the person I was, the girl who wore holes in her shoes, and the person I had become was a chasm that I filled with the cold, hard weight of my iron key. I had spent $25,000 on private investigators, but the return on that investment was going to be the total dissolution of the Sapphire name and the seizure of every asset they had spent 14 years stealing. I watched the clock on my wall, a sleek, brushed aluminum piece from a high-end gallery in Chelsea, and I realized that the time for observation was ending and the time for execution was beginning. My father, Richard, was currently at a steakhouse in Chicago, likely drinking a $100 glass of whiskey and bragging about the merger that would make him a centimillionaire, completely oblivious to the fact that his invisible daughter was the lead architect of his demise. He thought he had successfully buried Iris Sapphire in a grease-stained apron, but he had actually planted a seed that had grown into a forest of litigation that was about to fall on his head. I had spent my entire adult life learning the language of money, and I knew that the ultimate sentence for a white-collar criminal wasn't just prison, but the total and public loss of status and the freezing of every single dollar they possessed. I had already prepared the paperwork to flag the $114,000 in fraudulent credit lines with the 3 major credit bureaus, ensuring that the moment the audit went public, my parents' personal credit would be nuked into the Stone Age. I had tracked their offshore accounts to the point where I could predict the exact day of the month they would move funds to cover their mortgage in Highland Woods, and I had timed the audit's discovery phase to coincide with their largest upcoming payment. The cage was finished, the bars were made of undeniable facts and audited figures, and the lock was the very identity they had tried to steal from me. Family isn't a debt that you spend your life paying back to people who never valued you. It's a ledger that occasionally needs to be cleared with a final, devastating audit. As I closed my laptop and felt the weight of the black flash drive in my pocket, I knew that the next time I saw my father, it wouldn't be as a daughter seeking a paycheck, but as the senior partner who would be reading him his financial rights. The 14 months of silence were about to end with a roar that would be heard from Oak Haven to Wall Street. The setup was a masterpiece of architectural and psychological precision, unfolding within the hyper-sanitized confines of the Sterling Glass Tower in downtown Chicago at exactly 10 a.m. on a Tuesday that felt as sharp as a razor blade. The boardroom on the 64th floor was a cathedral of modern commerce, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the steel-gray expanse of Lake Michigan and a table made of a single 22-foot slab of polished black obsidian that seemed to swallow the light from the recessed LED fixtures above. I sat at the head of that table, my back turned to the heavy double doors, my silhouette framed by the morning sun as I meticulously turned the pages of a 400-page forensic audit report bound in heavy navy blue cardstock. The paper was high-grade 90-pound bond, and every time I turned a page, the crisp, rhythmic snap echoed through the silent room like a countdown. I was wearing a bespoke charcoal wool blend suit from Max Mara, and my hair was pulled back into a knot so tight it felt like a physical manifestation of my focus, a far cry from the frayed ponytail and grease-splattered polo shirt I had worn for a decade at the diner. I had spent 14 years preparing for this specific seating arrangement, and as I heard the muffled chime of the private elevator opening in the vestibule, I felt my pulse settle into the steady, mechanical thrum of a machine that had finally been switched to its highest gear. My parents, Richard and Eleanor, along with my brother Declan, practically vibrated into the room, their presence announced by a cloud of cloying, expensive scents, my father's heavy Tom Ford Oud wood, and my mother's sharp floral Chanel No. 5, that failed to mask the distinct metallic odor of desperation that clung to them like a second skin. They were dressed in $3,000 Italian silk suits and designer cocktail dresses that had been purchased using the very same $114,000 in fraudulent credit lines I had traced back to my own stolen Social Security number. Declan, now 24 and wearing a smirk that suggested he had already spent the $5.2 million buyout in his head, was busy shaking hands with the junior associates from Global Titan Corp., his movements jerky and filled with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told the word no. My father was laughing, a loud, booming sound that bounced off the glass walls, a sound intended to project the image of old money stability to the investors he was currently trying to swindle. He slapped a leather briefcase onto the obsidian table, the gold hardware clicking with a vulgar brightness, and he began to hold court, oblivious to the fact that the woman at the head of the table wasn't just a consultant, but the ghost of the daughter he had abandoned on the side of a highway. The sheer audacity of their performance was breathtaking to witness from my vantage point as they treated the boardroom like a victory lap before a single document had been signed. My mother was admiring her reflection in the polished surface of the table, adjusting a pearl necklace that I knew from my data mining had been invoiced as a safety equipment upgrade for the Sapphire Logistics trucking fleet. They were talking about the $5.2 million as if it were already sitting in their accounts, discussing plans for a summer home in Lake Geneva and a new 2025 Bentley Continental for Declan to inevitably destroy. They didn't even glance at me, assuming I was merely a high-level technical auditor from Vanguard Forensic Group, whose only job was to provide the final rubber stamp on the merger. To them, I was part of the furniture, a functional obstacle to be bypassed on their way to the champagne toast that was currently chilling in a silver bucket on the sideboard. They had spent their entire lives treating people as tools or inconveniences, and their failure to recognize me was the final, definitive proof that they had never truly seen me at all. Not as a child, not as a student, and certainly not as a threat. I continued to flip through the audit report, my eyes scanning the familiar rows of red-inked discrepancies that documented the systematic looting of Sapphire Logistics' operational capital. I could hear my father's voice behind me, bragging to the global Titan representatives about his visionary approach to supply chain management, while I was looking at a spreadsheet that proved his only vision was finding new ways to forge my signature on high-interest predatory loans. The contrast between his manufactured narrative and the hyper-realistic rot contained within the pages of my report was a chasm that was about to swallow him whole. Every time he spoke, I noted a new lie, a new layer of the old money facade he was desperately trying to maintain, and I felt a profound sense of clinical detachment. I wasn't the girl who needed his love anymore. I was the lead forensic auditor who had just spent 14 months building a cage made of 10K filings and offshore bank statements, and I was about to turn the key. The junior associates were nodding along to my father's anecdotes, their pens poised over their leather-bound notebooks, completely unaware that the woman at the head of the table had already initiated a freeze on the Sapphire Group's primary operating accounts. As the clock on the wall hit 10:05 a.m., the lead counsel for Global Titan, a man named Marcus, who had been my primary contact during the 14-month investigation, cleared his throat and gestured toward me. He signaled for the meeting to formally begin, and the room suddenly went quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the city far below us. My family took their seats on the opposite side of the table, Declan sitting directly across from my empty chair, leaning back with a look of bored entitlement. My father sat in the center, his hands folded over his briefcase, looking every bit the successful patriarch he had spent 14 years pretending to be. They waited for me to turn around, expecting a polite introduction and a summary of the merger's financial benefits. They expected a woman who would facilitate their escape into a life of luxury, not the person who had been documenting their crimes in the shadows for a decade. I could feel the heat of their gaze on the back of my neck, but I didn't move yet. I wanted them to sit in that silence for just a few seconds longer, to let the weight of the sterling glass tower press down on them. The moral of the setup is that arrogance is the ultimate blind spot, a flaw that allows people to walk right into the center of their own destruction without ever realizing the floor has been removed. My parents and brother were so consumed by the reflection of their own perceived success that they didn't notice the shadows moving around them. They thought the $5.2 million buyout was a reward for their cunning, when in reality, it was the bait for a trap that had been set years ago in a library at Yale. They had spent 14 years thinking they were the hunters, and I was the prey they had successfully driven into the wilderness, never imagining that the wilderness is where you learn how to track and kill. As I prepared to turn the chair around, I felt a sense of finality that was almost spiritual, a closing of a circle that had begun with a forged letter and a pair of handcuffs. The light in the room was bright, unforgiving, and perfect for the forensic revelation that was about to take place. I slowly closed the navy blue audit report, the sound of the heavy cardstock slapping together acting like a gavel in the silence of the boardroom. I didn't rush the movement. I savored the tactical precision of the moment, knowing that once I turned around, the Sapphire family as they knew it would cease to exist. My father shifted in his seat, his Rolex submariner catching the light, and I heard him mutter something to my mother about how these consultants always love the drama. He still thought this was a performance he could control, a narrative he could edit to suit his needs. He didn't realize that the ledger was absolute and that my presence at the head of this table was the final non-negotiable entry in his life's balance sheet. I placed my hands flat on the obsidian surface of the table, feeling the cool, unyielding stone against my palms, and I finally rotated the high-back ergonomic chair to face them. The silence that followed was a physical entity, a vacuum that sucked the air out of the room as the realization slowly dawned on their faces. My mother's hand went to her throat, her fingers clutching the stolen pearls so hard the string looked like it might snap. My father's face went from a confident bronze to a sickly, mottled gray, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at the woman he had tried to bury in a diner apron 14 years ago. Declan just looked confused, his small mind struggling to bridge the gap between the worthless waitress and the senior partner of Vanguard Forensic Group. None of them spoke. They couldn't. The shock was too absolute. The hyper-realism of my presence too devastating to process in a single breath. I looked at my father, seeing the lines of age and whiskey on his face, and I didn't feel a flicker of the old iris sapphire. I only felt the cold, unwavering resolve of the auditor. I opened the first page of the report, adjusted the high-end reading glasses I had purchased for this specific day, and I began to speak in a voice that was as filtered and scentless as the air in the sterling glass tower. "Good morning, Richard," I said, my voice carrying across the table with the weight of a death sentence. "We have a lot to discuss before anyone signs anything today." I turned my high-back ergonomic chair around at exactly 10:12 a.m., the motorized mechanism whirring with a soft, clinical precision that felt like the final gear of a trap snapping into place. The silence that filled the boardroom of the sterling glass tower was absolute. A heavy, deafening vacuum that seemed to suck the very oxygen from the room as my parents and brother stared at the woman they had spent 14 years trying to erase. My mother, Diane, let out a sharp, choked gasp as her hand flew to her mouth, and I watched with a detached, observational focus as her $400 Michael Kors leather handbag slid from her lap and hit the polished white oak floor with a dull, heavy thud. "Hello, Richard." "Hello, Diane," I said, my voice coming out as smooth and cold as the $2,000 charcoal gray Max Mara tailored blazer that clung to my shoulders like a suit of armor. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, and I didn't offer them the satisfaction of a daughter's hurt. Instead, I looked at them with the unblinking, analytical gaze of a lead forensic auditor who had already reached a final verdict. My father's face, which had been flushed with the arrogant glow of an impending $5 million payday, drained of all color until he looked like a wax figure melting under the harsh, unforgiving LED lights of the boardroom. For the next 45 minutes, the only sound in that 64th floor sanctuary was the steady, rhythmic turning of pages and the calm, unwavering cadence of my voice as I dismantled their lives with the surgical precision of a financial executioner. I didn't yell because shouting is for the weak and the desperate, and I was neither. I simply read from the 400-page audit report I had spent 14 months constructing with the help of $25,000 worth of private investigators and high-end data mining. I detailed 48 specific counts of wire fraud, each one backed by a time-stamped digital trail and a routing number that led directly back to the Sapphire Logistics operating accounts. I laid out the evidence of the $114,000 in identity theft, showing the board exactly how my parents had used my Social Security number to open credit lines at 3 different boutique banks to fund the very suits they were currently wearing. I moved on to the systematic money laundering scheme involving the Suds and Shine Car Wash on 4th Street in Oak Haven, explaining with hyper-realistic detail how they had inflated water usage reports and electricity bills to wash $3 million in illicit consulting fees over a 5-year period. I didn't look at my parents as I spoke. I looked at the global Titan Corp executives, handing out thick navy blue folders embossed with the Vanguard Forensic Group seal to every man and woman sitting at the obsidian table. By the time I reached page 50 of the report, which detailed the offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands used to hide the diversion of employee pension funds, the CEO of Global Titan, a man named Marcus Sterling, slowly stood up from his chair. He didn't say a word to my father, who was now trembling so violently his gold Rolex rattled against the table. He simply caught the eye of his lead security officer standing by the glass doors and gave a single sharp nod of his head. The contrast in the room was a living, breathing thing, the high-end, filtered air of the tower clashing with the sudden, sharp scent of my brother Declan's cold sweat as the reality of his situation finally pierced his thick veil of entitlement. Declan started hyperventilating, his chest heaving under his $3,000 Italian silk jacket as he realized that the $80,000 signing bonus he had already mentally spent on a 2024 Ducati Panigale was now a potential 10-year prison sentence in a federal facility. He looked at me with eyes wide with terror. the golden boy finally seeing the monster he and my parents had created in the shadows of their own greed. I watched as he fumbled with his tie, the knot suddenly feeling like a noose, while our mother reached out a trembling hand toward me, her voice a pathetic, wavering whisper as she tried to call me by my name, a name she hadn't earned the right to speak in over a decade. I ignored her entirely, my focus remaining on the spreadsheets that documented every single dollar they had siphoned from my future to fuel their masquerade of suburban perfection. I explained how they had forged my signature on a $500,000 business line of credit, pointing out the specific anatomical inconsistencies in the forged loops of the letters that my handwriting analysis experts had flagged in their $6,000 forensic report. The hyper-realism of the moment was intoxicating, from the way the dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight hitting the obsidian table to the way my father's expensive Tom Ford cologne seemed to turn sour and acidic in the stagnant air. I detailed the precise dates and amounts of the 16 wire transfers made to a private account at Credit Suisse, totaling $2.4 million, which were labeled as equipment maintenance, but were actually used to purchase the Highland Woods estate they currently called home. My father tried to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air, but I simply held up a single finger to silence him, never breaking the rhythm of my presentation. I was a machine of accountability, a personified ledger that was finally, after 14 years of being treated like a ghost, coming to collect on a debt that had accrued a lifetime of interest. The global Titan executives were no longer looking at the Sapphire family as business partners. They were looking at them as biohazards, leaning back in their ergonomic chairs to create as much physical distance as possible from the fraud that was being laid bare on the black granite before them. The technical specifications of their downfall were my greatest triumph, and I made sure to include the exact model numbers and purchase prices of the fleet of 2021 Peterbilt 579 sleeper cabs that had been bought with laundered funds and registered under a defunct LLC I had tracked to a P.O. box in Delaware. I showed the board the photos taken by my private investigators of the logistics warehouse in Oak Haven, which was actually just a rented 4,000-square-foot garage containing nothing but 3 rusted pallets and a stack of forged shipping manifests. By the time I reached the final section of the report, the section documenting the $114,000 in credit card debt they had accrued in my name while I was scrubbing toilets at Yale, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from a business meeting to a crime scene. My father slumped in his chair, his head in his hands, finally realizing that his invisible daughter hadn't just survived. She had become the architect of his total and public destruction. He had spent 14 years thinking he was the hunter, and I was the prey. But as I closed the final folder with a sharp, final snap, he knew that the auditor was the only one in the room with any power left. I sat there for a moment in the silence that followed my 45-minute monologue, feeling the cool weight of my $2,500 reading glasses in my hand as I looked at the wreckage of my family. I felt no pity for the woman on the floor reaching for her designer bag, nor for the man who had traded his daughter's future for a bottle of expensive whiskey and a gated community zip code. My name is Iris Thorne now, but for this 1 hour in this specific boardroom, I was the ghost of Iris Sapphire, and I was finally finishing the work that began on the side of Route 41. The moral of the ledger is that you cannot hide the truth in a world governed by numbers, because numbers don't care about your silk robes, your luxury SUVs, or the lies you tell your neighbors. They only care about the balance, and today, the balance for the Sapphire family was 0. As the security officers stepped forward to escort them into a private side room where federal agents from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division were already waiting, I stood up and smoothed the fabric of my blazer. I didn't look back as the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind them, leaving the scent of their desperation in the past where it belonged. I walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city of Chicago spreading out below me. And for the first time in 32 years, I felt the lightness of a ledger that had finally been reconciled to the very last cent. The air in the boardroom was beginning to clear, the smell of my mother's Chanel No. 5 dissipating as the high-tech ventilation system worked to scrub the room of their presence. I watched a black 2024 Chevrolet Tahoe pull up to the curb 64 stories below, knowing it was the transport for the federal team I had been coordinating with for the last 8 months. My father had once used a vehicle just like that to watch me be arrested, and now a similar vehicle would be the last thing he saw before the iron gates of a federal holding facility closed behind him. Dignity isn't something you can buy at a boutique in Greenwich or steal from a 17-year-old girl with a full-ride scholarship. It is the quiet, unbreakable strength of the person who stays when everyone else has fled into the shadows of their own deceit. I looked at the 400-page report lying on the table, a testament to 14 years of silence and study, and I realized that I had finally built a home for myself, not out of bricks and mortar, but out of the truth. Family is who stands by you when you have nothing, and since my parents had spent my entire life ensuring I had nothing, I owed them exactly what I had delivered today: a cold, hard look at the emptiness of their own souls. The meeting was over, the merger was dead, and as I walked toward the elevator, I felt a sense of peace that was more valuable than any $5 million buyout could ever be. I was no longer a revenue stream with a heartbeat. I was a woman who had audited her own life and found that the most important asset I possessed was the courage to walk away from the people who never deserved me in the first place. The elevator chime was a soft, melodic note that signaled the end of my final chapter in the Sapphire story, and as I stepped inside the brushed steel cabin, I caught my reflection in the polished doors. I saw a woman who was tired. Yes, but also a woman who was completely and utterly free from the debt of familial expectation. I thought about the girl on the thrift store mattress at Yale, the girl with the holes in her sneakers and the smell of bleach in her hair, and I whispered a silent thank you to her for not giving up when the math didn't add up. She was the one who had done the hard work, the one who had carried the weight of the betrayal until it became the muscle I used to tear down their empire. The doors slid shut with a whisper, and as the floor indicator began its rapid descent toward the lobby, I let out the breath I had been holding since that Tuesday morning in August of 2010. The audit was complete, the books were closed, and for the first time in my life, I was heading home to a place where no one would ever ask me to pay for someone else's Lexus again. The final reconciliation of the Sapphire estate did not end with a handshake or a tearful apology, but with the cold, rhythmic thud of a judge's gavel echoing through a sterile courtroom in the Dirksen Federal Building. Today, Sapphire Logistics is not a thriving empire or a symbol of suburban prestige, but a hollowed-out carcass of a company that has been picked clean by the bankruptcy courts and the relentless precision of the Internal Revenue Service. My father, Richard Sapphire, is currently serving 36 months in a minimum security federal correctional institution in Duluth, Minnesota, where his bespoke Italian suits have been replaced by a coarse orange polyester blend, and his $1,200 a month whiskey habit has been traded for lukewarm tap water and the bitter taste of a shattered ego. My mother, Diane, the woman who once looked down at me from a pedestal of silk and pearls, is now living in a 400-square-foot studio apartment in a dilapidated section of Oak Haven, the kind of place where the wallpaper is peeling at the corners and the radiator hisses with a desperate metallic groan every time the Chicago wind howls against the single-pane windows. In a twist of fate that is almost too poetic to be a coincidence, she is currently working the exact same double shift at Miller's Greasy Spoon that I once did, scrubbing the same industrial-grade grease traps and enduring the same dismissive glances from customers who view her as a nameless servant. I blocked their phone numbers on every device I own at exactly 5 p.m. on the day the final sentencing was handed down, but not before I sent one final non-negotiable communication to their legal representatives. It wasn't a letter of forgiveness or a plea for reconciliation. It was a formal, itemized invoice for the $114,000 they stole from my future using my Social Security number, calculated with a compounded annual interest rate of 8.5% that brought the total to a staggering $294,000. I didn't send it because I needed the money. as my career as a senior partner at Vanguard Forensic Group has provided me with more wealth than they ever managed to steal, but because every ledger must be balanced before it can be closed forever. I wanted them to see the number, to feel the weight of the debt they had accrued over 14 years of systemic abuse, and to understand that in the world of the auditor, there are no free rides and there are no family discounts. I am no longer the financial battery they use to power their fraudulent dreams. I am the powerhouse that stands at the center of my own meticulously constructed reality. A woman who built a penthouse life out of the rubble of a suburban nightmare. My current residence is a 3,000-square-foot glass sanctuary on the 72nd floor of a high-rise in the Gold Coast, featuring a wraparound terrace that offers an unobstructed, breathtaking view of the city skyline that my parents can no longer afford to even step foot in. Every morning, I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a cup of freshly ground Blue Mountain coffee, looking down at the tiny, moving lights of the city below and remembering the smell of the diner's burnt oil that used to live under my fingernails. The hyper-realism of my success is a constant, quiet hum in the background of my life, the feel of the 500 thread count Egyptian cotton sheets, the silent operation of my custom-built server rack, and the weight of the platinum key fob for my 2025 Midnight Emerald Bentley Continental GT Speed. I didn't reach this height by clinging to a blood bond that was designed to drown me. I reached it by recognizing that family is a social contract, and when one party commits a breach of the magnitude my parents did, the contract is null and void. The moral of my story is that your origins do not dictate your destination, and the people who try to bury you are often the very ones who provide the soil you need to grow into something they can no longer control. The silence of my penthouse is a luxury I earned through a decade of screaming internal rage and exhaustive 80-hour work weeks. I remember a specific moment last week when I received a letter from my brother Declan's public defender, asking for a character reference to help mitigate his upcoming sentencing for his role in the wire fraud scheme. I read the letter while sitting on my terrace, the cool breeze from the lake ruffling the pages of a high-end architectural digest, and I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no pity, and certainly no obligation to help a man who had high-fived our father while I was being led away in handcuffs. I placed the letter in my marble fireplace and watched as the flames consumed the desperate pleas for mercy, the ash rising into the night sky like the ghosts of the sapphire name. Declan will serve his time just as our father is, and he will learn that a 2024 Porsche 911 GT3 RS is a very poor substitute for a moral compass when the federal government comes to seize your assets. They are all being held accountable for the math they thought they could ignore, and I am the one who handed the prosecutors the calculator. The technical specifications of my independence are etched into the very fabric of my daily routine, from the way I manage my own diverse investment portfolio to the way I have ensured that my identity is protected by the most advanced biometric security systems available. I have reclaimed my name, not as a sapphire, but as Iris Thorn, a brand that stands for integrity, precision, and an uncompromising dedication to the truth. My mother's life at the diner is a mirror image of the life she forced upon me, but with one crucial difference. I was a girl with a future who was being suppressed, while she is a woman with a past who is being reconciled. I don't feel a shred of guilt when I think of her scrubbing those floors in her cheap, slip-resistant shoes, because I know that she stood by and smiled while those same floors were the boundaries of my world. The debt is settled, the audit is closed, and the interest has been paid in full through the total dissolution of their reputations and the permanent loss of their freedom. Family isn't blood. Family is the people who stay when the truth comes out, the ones who don't ask you to set your own life on fire to keep their illusions warm. For a long time, I thought I was alone in that library at Yale or on that thrift store mattress, but I realize now that I was simply in a cocoon of my own making, preparing for the day I would finally emerge as the powerhouse I was always meant to be. I look at the city of Chicago at night, a glittering grid of numbers and lights, and I realize that I am exactly where I belong, above the noise, beyond the reach of their parasitic needs and completely in control of the ledger. I have chosen my future over my blood, and in doing so, I have discovered that the only person who truly has the power to define your worth is the one you see in the mirror when the lights go down. The glass boardroom was their prison, and the penthouse is my fortress, and I wouldn't trade a single hour of the struggle for the peace I have finally found in the absolute, undeniable truth of the numbers. My name is Iris Thorne, and this is the final entry in the Sapphire audit. The hyper-realistic details of my parents' new lives are a constant reminder of the cost of their arrogance, reported to me in quarterly updates by the private investigation firm I still keep on a modest retainer. I know that my father's cell in Duluth is exactly 8 by 10 feet, and that he spends his time in the prison library trying to explain to anyone who will listen that he was a victim of a corporate conspiracy. I know that my mother's studio apartment smells of stale cabbage and industrial cleaner, a scent that she once thought was beneath her, and that she has to walk 3 blocks to the bus stop every morning because her 2023 Tahoe was repossessed 3 weeks after the merger collapsed. These facts don't bring me joy, but they bring me a sense of order, a confirmation that the world operates on a system of cause and effect that even the Sapphire family couldn't bypass. I have replaced the hole in my sneakers with a foundation of solid, audited success, and I have replaced the shadow in my heart with the brilliant, focused light of my own ambition. As I prepare for a new merger investigation, one that involves a legitimate company with ethical leaders, I feel a sense of professional pride that has nothing to do with revenge. I am the lead forensic auditor for Global Horizon Holdings now, a position I earned through merit and a reputation for being the most thorough investigator in the business. I am no longer running away from Oakhaven. I am building a legacy that will last long after the Sapphire name is a forgotten footnote in a bankruptcy filing. Dignity, I have learned, is the ability to look back at your past without blinking, to acknowledge the pain without letting it define your future, and to stand at the head of the table knowing you earned every single inch of the seat. The final invoice has been sent, the numbers have been reconciled, and for the first time in 32 years, the balance is perfect. I am Iris Thorne, the powerhouse of my own life, and the only history that matters is the one I am writing now.